Next up, we have Tom Ewing from BrainJuicer, where he's content director. And Tom is going to talk about behavior changes, 5 things that he says work.
Hi. Yes, I'm Tom Ewing. I'm from BrainJuicer. We are a full-spectrum market research agency, but one of the things that we do, that we've been sort of focusing on really over the last couple of years, experimenting with, trying stuff out, is behavior change. Not internal corporate behavior change, but commercial behavior change, getting people to do things differently. So this presentation is really a kind of a distillation of what we've learned doing these kind of projects, and a sort of I guess a kind of step-by-step should you want, as an agency or as a client, to do one of them yourself. And we've basically just broken it down into 5 steps. The first is the strategic relevance of the change, working out what exactly it is you want to change. Second step is researching around the change to understand the context of it. The third step is to actually create the activation, because this is a very practical kind of research. It goes beyond insight and into action, and it's all about the hands-on approach, actually getting out into the field generally, or online in a kind of live setting, and creating the activations you want. Implementation, managing the pilot, which can be quite complex, out in the field, and finally making sure that you've got something measurable, so that you know you're doing something real. So the first of these is to identify the behavior you want to change. And what we found is that actually companies are often pretty, it can be a more difficult question than people imagine. One of the reasons is that we're so used to thinking, I think, in research along kind of in quite an abstract level, along kind of quite strategic level, thinking about brand and thinking in terms of soft metrics, like kind of image scores and kind of moving these, numbers on a graph and such like, that we lose sight of the fact that at base, our job is to help companies find out how to get people to do something that is different from what they were doing yesterday. Whether it to be start a new behavior, stop an old behavior, do more of something they're already doing, do less of something. And actually, once you've gone through the exercise of simply narrowing it down and identifying the exact behavior that you want, you can often get quite a good idea of how difficult the resulting behavior change task is going to be. So, for instance, it tends to be quite a lot more complicated to get people to start doing a completely new kind of behavior than it does to get them to simply kind of increase or decrease. And completely stopping behavior can be very difficult as well, because it's terribly ingrained. So, for instance, stopping smoking is a very difficult behavior change problem, whereas kind of buying a little bit more of something or eating a little bit more fruit a day, for instance, is a relatively quite a lot easier one. Once you've identified the behavior that you want to change, you have to start researching the context that it happens in. Now, I believe there was a presentation this morning, unfortunately I missed it, I was in another track, which was talking about kind of moving away a little bit from questions of why, and perhaps moving towards questions of how. And this is something we really endorse for these kind of projects. As researchers, we spend an awful lot of time thinking about why. Now, it's a very interesting question, why. It's a terribly useful question if you can get the answer to it. But a lot of the time, simply asking people why merely gets them to kind of interiorize and post-rationalize and come up with credible sounding answers. But just actually looking at how they behave and looking at how they seem to make decisions can give you much more valuable information. One thing we did, for instance, is give people kind of wearable glasses to wear and just told them to go off and do things, do shopping, do kind of normal things. And they took it was really interesting seeing what they paused at, what they didn't look at, what they kind of, what took a quick amount of time, what took a slow amount of time. It gives you a really big insight into the environment. Sometimes you can actually just go and look at the environment. You can just explore the environment in which decisions happen. And it gives you those necessary ideas, those necessary hypotheses to take to stage 3. And this is kind of the fun bit, where you're creating the activations. Now, Behaviour change falls kind of broadly, it's often discussed in terms of behavioural economics, which has been quite a buzzword in the marketing and research and kind of wider industries. One of the problems is that, to a certain extent, people have been sold a myth of behavioural economics by books like Freakonomics, Super Freakonomics, and other very popular books, Nudge and such like. We've used these books ourselves. They're excellent books, but they tend to create this idea of the single dramatic intervention that can completely change everything, and that's somehow counterintuitive, that goes against the grain of thinking. So a lot of the time when people are thinking about behavior change, they start thinking, oh, well, what we need to do, there must be some hidden thing that we need to do. Often, actually, it's much more like a kind of quality process. You're looking for little things that together will actually make a kind of large impact, and that might individually shift the needle quite a small amount, but you might simply need that extra pair of eyes to look upon. It doesn't have to be kind of counterintuitive findings, deep-rooted in psychology and behavioral science. It can be some fairly easy stuff. So a couple of the things I'm going to show you counters that. This is an example of a behavior change intervention for Drinkaware. Drinkaware are a UK charity. Their job is, they're funded by the drinks industry, and their job is to get people to binge drink less. If any of you have been to British cities on a Friday night, you will know that getting British people to binge drink less is one of the harder behavioural tasks that marketers might be asked to do. And Drinkaware came up with a hypothesis. Their hypothesis is that if people drank more water, they would drink less booze. And so the rate of drinking could be slowed. Every British bar and pub has to offer free water. It's the law. So we said, OK, let's just try and make these more available. And so what they did was they put, rather than have it kind of behind the bar in a fridge, they had it out of the bar on a tub. And then this big poster, very, very simple, plain poster, showing a guy drinking some free water, was put up in the bar. Now, this was actually based in a psychological principle, that of mirroring, the idea that when you see somebody do something, you yourself will want to do it. And so we thought that simply that kind of simple picture would trigger people into drinking the water. The intervention was a success in terms of getting people to drink more water. 300% more water was drunk in the trials. Unfortunately, the level of alcohol that was drunk did not change at all. People just went to the toilet more. So the hypothesis was disproven. This is one of the things that doing behavior change work is very interesting. Often when you're doing normal market research, you end up kind of with an actionable recommendation, and your actionable recommendation, very high-mindedly put, is kind of, sits there, and it's not really, you don't get to find out whether it works or not. Maybe you can take credit for it, maybe you'll come back and do a case study. The great thing about this kind of work is that you get to find out hands-on whether it worked or not. Often the answer's not, but that's a learning. That's something you can take away and say, right, we tried that, we're not doing that again, gets people to drink more water, they just go for a wee. Here is an example of how you don't really need psychological insights to create behavior change initiatives. This is a behavior which is theoretically available, but not done very much. It's in a vending machine, and you can pay with a debit card or contactless payment. Most people don't. They simply put coins in the vending machine. MasterCard wanted people to use the vending machine more. And this was something where you could have sat down and kind of thought, OK, attitudinally, what's the attitudes here? Let's dig deep into maybe the semiotics of vending machines. Let's kind of work out the kind of psychographics of vending machine users. Maybe run a segmentation. Maybe put a yellow ring around it and just make it a bit more visible. Make the choice and the decision a bit more available. So that's what happened. That's what happened on the vending machine. Just kind of make it a little bit more prominent. And there was a 74% increase in people using the vending machine, using debit cards at it rather than cash. And then very similarly, this is something for Sodexo, a hospital washing thing, where there was this big problem about hand cleanliness, and one of the big flashpoints in the hospital is the canteen, where people are eating, they're handling food, and everyone was sitting around saying, oh, there must be something really clever we can do. And then someone said, well, actually, look, can we just put a wipe on the tray, a free wipe on the tray? And they went, oh, yeah. And it doesn't take a kind of great, psychological genius. It just takes people working fairly closely with companies, often kind of being the outside pair of eyes, having a look and having those ideas. Once you've had those ideas, you have to start testing them. And this can get quite complicated, and it can require quite complex skill sets. Going back to Drinkaware, one thing that Drinkaware wanted to do was reduce the amount of violence and sexual harassment in what they call the nighttime economy, but basically that just means pubs and clubs and nightclubs. And this is quite a tricky task. And various kind of behavioral methods were spent doing it. One problem, of course, is that the people doing this bad behavior, if you confront them directly with it, or if you kind of, they're not particularly kind of persuasion-based campaigns won't work, and confronting them, given that they've been drinking and they're already in a situation where they're getting violent or sexually aggressive, can be actually quite a kind of dangerous thing to do. So what we decided, or what Drinkaware agreed, is that it was a good problem to take a social approach on. Going by what Mark Earls talks about, our innate need to copy, our innate kind of behavior as a social animal, if you could simply kind of make the norm of behavior in nightclubs friendlier and less aggressive and less kind of like uncomfortable, then you could move to a point where behavior might start to change. And so the intervention in question was this host program. And it turned into quite a large-scale intervention in these nightclubs, where the idea was that you would have people whose job it was to be kind of just having fun and having a good time in a friendly, non-aggressive way. And they would carry around with them kind of things like free water, free like phone cards if people had lost their phone or something, or things, free lollipops to kind of hand out if people were getting a bit kind of aggressive, just things that would kind of calm the mood and make the nightclub a friendlier place. Now, having come up with this idea on paper, of course, implementing it is then quite another matter, because you have to do things like sourcing the supplies that these people are going to have. You have to do training. We in Drinkaware were very lucky in that we got to work with a kind of charities that specialized in these kind of sort of behaviors and in kind of like safety and self-prevention. You obviously needed a very particular set of skills among the people who were playing these host roles, so some level of self-defense, and also they needed probably to be kind of extroverts and happy to engage with strangers. And you needed then to design uniforms, to design a logo, to design posters that would let people in the club know that this thing was happening. And so all of this was kind of stuff that the researchers working on the project really had to kind of, they had to both learn some of these skills themselves, and secondly, recognize when they didn't have the skills and kind of move to finding people who did. And ultimately, there isn't enough of a level, thankfully, of violence and such like an aggressive incident in these clubs to make a quantitative pilot practical on the scale. So we weren't going to see kind of quantitative things. We were reliant on qualitative feedback. The qualitative feedback was very positive, and the program is now, I believe, being rolled out by Drinkaware in a lot of UK cities in the northeast. And it's really satisfying working on a project like this and thinking, this is great, you're actually doing some kind of good. But it does require this enormous kind of amount of skills. And that kind of brings me on to the final thing, which is testing, which is measuring the change. Obviously, you're working in the field, so the project design needs to be quite kind of can be quite kind of complex. You really have to take into account seasonality. Are there any seasonal events that might bias the data? How long an experiment is going to last to get you the results you need? The number of locations you're going to be using, other levels of variability, what are the other sources of noise in the data, because there's definitely going to be some. You can't control everything when you're doing kind of field tests. It's not like an academic study. And the number of instances and the kind of level of testing you're going to be doing in each location. But do all that and you there's kind of, again, great satisfaction to be had in knowing that you've got something which feels like a really robust result, a robust behavior change result. Here, going back to our binge drinking thing, which proved, as you'll learn from this, a very hard nut to crack. This was where we were testing some creative, actually. An ad agency, they come up with some creative to get people to drink lower alcohol by volume. So it's like, okay, if we can't get people to drink less booze, what at least we can do is get them to drink weaker booze. So the ad agency produced these posters which basically said, hey, you know, this lower strength alcohol is exactly the same as this higher strength alcohol, so why not buy the lower strength alcohol? And they were kind of, you know, they were very relevant, they were kind of on message posters, they were quite persuasive, they probably have tested quite well, and you'd have got people saying, yes, my intention would be, seeing these things, that I would indeed buy the things. But we were able to run them in actual supermarkets. And what we discovered is that, because the British drinker appears to be completely an inveterate soak, sales of beer, where we tried this tactic, the sales of low alcohol beer actually went down when we ran this creative. Because, of course, what was happening in the field, in the real world, was that people were looking at the creative and thinking, this is awesome, I can get a stronger beer for exactly the same price. So it was back to the drawing board for that. But that's an example of how, on the testing thing, doing this kind of work, you can actually go out and you find out if it works. So that's kind of the mentality, really, that you need to be doing these kind of projects. It tends to be things where you're working long-term with a client, running a battery of different tests, different interventions. Not all of them as large as the host, some of them very simple, like simply putting a circle around the debit card reader. But you're really kind of working on an awful lot of things, just kind of chipping away, moving fast, breaking stuff, or moving fast, improving stuff, hopefully, seeing what works, and then getting out quick if it doesn't. So just as a summary, the questions to ask if you want to run this kind of work: what behaviors do you want to change? What are your how questions rather than your why questions? How do you design for behavior change? What are the various designs that you're going to use? What skills do you need to implement these, to give these designs a fair go in the field? And finally, how do you measure the change once you're doing it? Thank you. Any questions?
So, questions for Tom? Well, I'll tell you, it's the second in a row, you people. Paying attention?
We've got one.
Oh, we got one? Okay. Get that person a mic.
One. Sorry, I'm a bit dazzled up here by the...
Great presentation, lovely accent. Is there a role for social data in any of this kind of testing?
As in social media?
Yeah, or listening research, you know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would probably say it was in... It would, like, first of all, the test and learn approach can be directly applied to social. So, for instance, we've done things where the actual behavior we wanted changed was, I want more likes and shares on my Facebook page. Now, whether or not this is a good aim or a bad aim, that was the aim, and that was what they came to us. And we kind of did a very similar set of things, and it worked, and they got more likes and shares. But then whether it then actually, it was a charity, whether it then led to any conversions and such like is another matter. In terms of the kind of listening stuff, I think there's probably there's a lot to learn from it, because of course in the observation phase where you're trying to research the environment decisions happen in, you can learn an awful lot from that. Probably not by kind of going as close in to the sort of brand level social listening. That's probably less useful in a lot of cases. But just to kind of get an idea of the occasions, kind of, you know, like looking on kind of, you know, just sort of looking at kind of tags on Instagram and kind of just getting an idea of what the use occasions and these kind of things and the kind of occasions on which they use might be like. You can get the real texture of that in, and social's massively useful for that, I would imagine. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have what, time for one more? Anyone else? I guess not. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for listening.